grab a seat. This is all very cozy. Good morning, everyone. I am Mark Savage from the BBC. I'm the chief music reporter for BBC News. Joining me today here is Laid Back Luke, DJ, producer. His new single just premiered yesterday.
Yeah.
We have Alexander, who's come from Deezer, one of the biggest streaming services in the world.
Good morning.
And Nick from Resident Advisor, electronic music curation website, an online portal for all music. So the theme is, are playlists replacing radio? So just quickly go around and tell me whether you think, in a word, yes or no, is that actually happening?
Yes, absolutely. No.
No.
Although I come from a streamer, but no.
And Nick?
Yes, I think they're not necessarily replacing, but they're becoming more influential than.
Yeah. So for a bit of context, around the world at the moment, just on the music streaming platforms, Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music, there's more than 100 million people globally listening to those every week. But in the UK, for example, 89% of adults still listen to radio every week. In America, the figure is 91%. So there's definitely, what I would say, there's a passing over maybe at the moment. Listening hours are going down, but people are accessing music in a whole lot of different ways. And millennials in particular are listening to music more on streaming than they do on radio. So to go into playlists themselves, everybody here is involved in curating playlists. How do you go about selecting the songs that you put on one of those lists? Luke?
Well, for me, it's very simple because I have my own independent record label, Mixmash Records. We can put our own music in there. And obviously, if we work together with young talents or other DJs, we'll swap playlists and that sort of thing. But I have discovered recently that like how smart the whole algorithm of these streaming platforms are. And you were mentioning playlists, but I think the discover function of the streaming platforms are a whole new thing.
And what does that mean for listeners? Does it mean that basically humans are being taken out of the equation altogether?
Pretty much. I do feel it's like the rising of the AI in music curation as well, where I sometimes look at my app and I'm thinking, wow, you know me better than myself.
It's certainly interesting. We did some focus groups at the BBC earlier this year where we asked young people how they listen to music, 16 to 24-year-olds. And they said, I just put one song on and then I listen to what comes next. They're not interested in seeking out new bands. They're not interested in going onto blogs and the kind of traditional ways of discovering music. They just trust the algorithm. Is that something that you find, Nick?
Yeah, and I think the algorithms can do or can play an important role in the aspect of music discovery. But I think with kind of curators and experts like Resident Advisor, we have a really important role within music, which is to broaden people's music tastes. And I think that's why it's so important that these large streaming platforms have a balance between algorithm curation based on who the individual is and what they like, but then also a kind of human hand that can kind of help broaden people's tastes and dig a little bit deeper within some of the catalogs that these streaming services have, which are infinitely deeper than I think people realize.
And Alexander, you're kind of the naysayer here. You think that playlists aren't replacing radio. So why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think replacement is always kind of when television was launched, it was supposed to replace cinema going, and all this doesn't seem to really happen. So if you, as you mentioned earlier, the radio listening in the UK is largely stable. There's still a staggering 90% of the people tuning into radio every week, and 21 hours spent on radio. And at the same time, obviously, streaming has become an unbelievably powerful tastemaker and carries a very weighty and global role in tastemaking. But I just want to object to the replacement statement. I mean, radio is going to be there for quite a while, and they're very complementary, and we work very closely with our radio partners. We give them opportunity to showcase their content to a totally different audience. recommendations. We give them on-demand capabilities on our platform for their podcasts. There's a variety of ways of working together with radio, so I don't see the replacement argument. Of course, playlists are incredibly powerful. Of course, the streaming platforms show unbelievable growth and will continue to do so over years to come.
Well, I was talking backstage with Alexander, and he mentioned, for instance, that they're constantly working on their algorithms. And the problem with an algorithm is that you kind of close yourself off to like any other new and exotic influences. And I do feel that the human aspect is very important still in there.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you see that you measure the success of algorithm-based recommendation, both on Flow, which is our key product, but also on algorithmically created playlists. You measure that by skip rates and by length of session and similar KPIs, and that bears the risk that we run into some elevator music phenomenon. We bring things out that are least offensive and not the ones that are really challenging. And this is where humans will play for years to come an important role. And this is why our editors constantly interact with our algorithms and test them and look at them, what they bring to the front.
One of the things that certainly seems to be happening in the UK, at least, is that the popularity of streaming and the way that that affects the top 40 charts has slowed down the discovery of new artists. It seems to be that when a user goes in and types in Ed Sheeran or goes to the top 40 playlist, they're only listening to the popular songs, they're reinforcing the popularity of those songs, and new artists are struggling to get through. So somebody like Dua Lipa, who's broken through this year, has taken 2.5 years, where normally the record industry could have made a star out of an artist like that in 6 months. So is that something that you see as a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, not necessarily, but if it's the common denominator that determines the music we all listen to, then yeah, that could be a problem. Because it used to always be about the tastemakers and the people on the forefront and that niche little underground corner that was into that music that no one was into. And is there an opportunity now for that music to grow? I must say, I must honestly say that the most exciting new music that I've recently discovered has been from my 14-year-old son.
Right.
Who somehow came...
I don't have that at all.
who came across like random YouTube acts, and he was showing that to me. And apparently this is happening in the underground right now, and both my my streaming platforms and my social networks didn't have a clue about that. And so I guess in a sense, like people being connected with each other is still a very strong point.
Alexander, how do you encourage people to discover new music, to veer off the treading path?
I think as a streaming platform, we pride ourselves with discovering new artists. We have an initiative which is called Deezer Next, where we intentionally go to artists that are not kind of the known top hit occupants. And what you mentioned earlier, indeed the way that hits are structured these days is possibly in a transitionary period not ideal. On the flip side of this, you can now listen to music on a global scale. Smaller bands are available to literally hundreds of millions of people across the globe. Do we as streamers surface them enough or not is a different question. But if you know about this band and if you invest your own time into finding exotic Peruvian pan flute music on Deezer, you'll find it. So I think this alone is a gigantic leap forward on disseminating music on a global scale.
I think there's also two things that streaming platforms offer that can be hugely beneficial for emerging artists, and that's, you know, especially if you're comparing it to radio, where, you know, traditional radio at least has kind of found success in its kind of regional focus, and obviously playlists don't have those same kind of regional restrictions. So I think as an emerging artist, if you can playlist in the right places, then compared to radio at least, then all of a sudden you've got an infinitely larger international audience with which to kind of foster a relationship and be discovered. And then the other thing I think that has changed a lot in the playlist space, certainly over the last few years, is just the richness of the data. that you can get from playlists, and that was obviously utilized for a long time by streaming platforms, but now more and more of that information is being made accessible to the artists. So now artists that are being featured in certain playlists and so on can see the types of people that are listening to their music, where those things are happening, and that's in a way that traditional radio could never kind of feed back that information. And to artists and managers now, that's absolutely crucial in terms of deciding the territories that you need to work harder to build a profile of your artist. You know, potentially you might be absolutely huge in South America, but you had no idea up until this point. So all of a sudden a touring schedule might include that, which allows you to build a relationship with an entire continent that you mightn't have been able to do before. So I think the richness and the immediacy of the data that can come through playlists and through streaming services can have an incredibly positive effect on emerging artists.
And I guess we've seen that this year, the success of J Balvin and Willie Williams' Despacito, which in traditional radio would have been ghettoized onto Spanish language stations in the US. Maybe we would have been played in Florida a little bit, but because it was doing so well on streaming, it crossed over to the mainstream. It was played on music television and became the biggest hit of the year, I think, in almost every territory. Is that encouraging to you as musicians and as experts?
Absolutely. I just now, and I guess I need to talk to Alexander a little bit more. Now I just need to find a way that every time someone Googles Ed Sheeran, my name pops.
Yeah, I want the same for me, although I'm not even a musician.
Okay. let's develop that. But for instance, Justin Bieber as well. He was famous on YouTube, and he was going viral over there until he got discovered. So I do think we live in that era where everything is possible, and the streaming makes the world a smaller place, for sure.
And you talked about your 14-year-old son, and you've got a track record of discovering artists like A-Track and others and signing them to your label. So is that now how you are delving into the underworld of music to find the latest talent?
Well, I do feel there's like a movement in sounds, and so for instance, the dance music that I know and that I operate in is changing, and I feel in the underground there's like things going on that will totally throw this over, and I do feel like in 5 years it's going to be very different. I know Martin Garrix is here somewhere as well, but like the big EDM DJs, it will be definitely something very more different and more to the streets and more like an urban thing, and you see it with the uprising of rap music again, that the sound is changing.
Alexander, in the traditional model, record labels send pluggers to radio stations, try and lobby them to play the biggest hits by their stars. Often they would do a deal where if one of our artists comes in and does an interview, you might play another song by a lesser-known artist on the label. To what extent does that system exist within streaming? Are the labels campaigning to try and get their songs onto your most popular playlists?
Yes, absolutely. And the difference, though, is unlike in radio, we have immediate feedback on how well this track performs, whether that's in a playlist or in Flow or wherever in our product it appears. So if we get lobbied by a label to put a lousy song into kind of one of our key playlists, we know 15 minutes later that the flow of the playlist drops exactly at that point, and we have to call back the label and say, like, look, it's not possible. We have to remove it.
And is it as quick as that, 15 minutes?
Well, no, it depends on where in the playlist this song sits. But I mean, we know immediately, we have instant access to the performance of these playlists. So therefore, we shield ourselves largely against that. And the labels obviously produce their own playlists, which we showcase on our product, and they have to deal with the performance of their repertoire rather than us. Our curators are encouraged to create content that is most suitable to the audience and not most suitable to a specific label.
And one of the other things I've wondered about is how it affects the music that is being made. I know a lot of the streaming services have mood-based playlists, for example. Here's a chill-out mix or a piano mix. I know the pop band Clean Bandit, for example, make a piano version of every single they release to go onto those piano-based playlists. Is there a sense that some of these heavily subscribed genre-based playlists are actually starting to dictate the music that gets made in the studio?
I mean, I would say at the end of the day, it has to come down to the quality of the curation. And if they make a record for a particular mood and it's good enough to feature in that playlist, then I don't see that as a detrimental thing, quite the opposite potentially. So I think as long as the curatorial influence is independent and it's based on the quality of the music and not, 7 or 8 other factors that might feed into it, then I think whether or not artists are, that's been happening for generations in terms of people making music that they felt was popular for a broader audience and things like that. So that's not necessarily new. I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to the curation of those playlists.
Well, for us as an indie label, we did adapt our sound to the newer platform. So a couple of years ago, all DJs were buying music from Beatport, for instance, which was mainly dance music-based music. Now we've moved on more and focused more on Spotify and all that sort of streaming. And that kind of music usually gets listened to in your car or like in a living room situation. And a lot of our playlists and the things we put out on the main Mixmash label has been catered to that. So we are very aware of the changing of the platforms. And there's a big gap, I all of a sudden realize on this podium, between dance music and where dance music gets listened at. So a lot of the dance music gets listened to in festivals, but not necessarily in a car situation or. And I feel that there's like a gap forming between DJ music and music where people listen to on the streams.
Is it useful for you to have your name out there as a brand to get people to listen to music?
Oh, absolutely. I think the better the marketing, the more people Google you, right?
Yeah. And similarly, I guess Resident Advisor is a trusted source. In a way, it's making playlists, but it has the reputation that, say, a Radio 1 or a Radio 2 would have in the electronic world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, essentially we play, hopefully, an important role in helping people discover electronic music, both new and old as well. I think there's been a bit of a shift, certainly within certain electronic music now, where people are looking back as much as they're looking forward. And I think, playlists allow a really simple, quick way to showcase the music and the sounds that define certain pivotal moments in electronic music culture. So some of our most popular playlists will be, music that was played by David Mancuso at the Loft, Paradise Garage, some of the early house records coming out of Chicago and things like that. And being able to do that in a really quick, simple way that kind of spotlights the interesting things that were happening musically at pivotal times in the development of a genre is something that we're allowed to do with playlists that we couldn't have done with technologies that were available to us kind of 5 or 6 years ago. And you can do it like that. And so kind of you can take playlists and kind of showcase new music to a broader audience and have the mainstream kind of things with Ed Sheeran and so on. Or you can kind of look at it from another angle and kind of help make some of the content that you're already featuring on the site become a richer kind of content experience, because people are used to listening to music through playlists and through streaming platforms now.
And Luke and Nick, you said at the beginning you do think that playlists are going to replace radio or are replacing radio. So why do you think that is? What are they offering that radio is missing out?
I think it's more based on a personal type of taste. Okay. So instead of someone determining your taste, it's the algorithms, it's the things you are used to that are coming at you now, instead of. So, sometimes on radio, you need to listen to a song like 10, 15 times before you actually get it. And so with playlists, you instantly get what you desire.
Nick?
I think, playlisting and streaming services offer an opportunity for the listener to engage with music in a way that they can't with traditional radio. So if you love something and you love it then and you love it there, that gives you a great opportunity to favorite it, to re-listen to it, to go back to a specific part of the record, to share it with all of your friends immediately. And that creates a richer kind of listening experience that traditional radio, whilst I still think is incredibly important, doesn't offer.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time, but thank you for the chat.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you.